This is the word of the Lord. I don't think it matters who we are. I think we all know something about salvation. The rescuer who comes in the nick of time, the cavalry appearing over yonder hill, the surf patrol crashing through the breakers to a distressed swimmer. In each of these saving scenarios, the rescuer overcomes the threat and plucks the person away from that which would otherwise overwhelm them. But what if the greatest threat arises from within us? What if there's something about our native human disposition from which we need to be saved? That's when there's a need for a new song to be sung. The salvation our God offers is significantly different from those other examples I just gave. It is effectively a transformation wrought by God, but within our own heart. What is it that we're being saved from? And in what manner are we being saved? Does God reach inside us and, like a surgeon might, surgeons cut us open and do all sorts of things with our internal organs? Is that the kind of idea here? I mean, obviously there's no literal sense of that. There's no scalpels and no blood. I would not be a minister if that was still involved. But figuratively or metaphorically, sure, the image of a kind of heart surgery might be suggestive of what God is doing in saving us. In this divine salvation, God is doing a work in us that radically reorients our deepest desires and motives. God is transforming us from being primarily caught up with ourselves to being utterly committed to the divinely eternal way of God's kingdom. Our hearts are won over as God reveals life-changing truth to us. In salvation, God reveals to us the true nature of righteousness. It's a funny word, righteousness. We don't use it that much anymore, except when we're, talking about self-righteousness, really. But righteousness is about right relationships, people relating well with one another. It's not something that we achieve or create by clever curation of our sense of reality. We don't make it up. It's not a world of pretend. Righteousness is objective. It exists in real time and space, in real relationships. It's about the way we behave and relate with others. It is discovered in the manner that we honour the image of God in all people everywhere, or indeed reveal our unrighteousness in our failure to do that. Natively, however, we don't know how to honour others appropriately. We must behold the glory of God and see that glory reflected in others around us to engender the right respect for other people. Even when the other person themselves fails to properly perceive that they are a bearer of this divine image, the way we relate to them can serve to awaken them to that greater reality for them as well. And the temptation is always to reflect back to the person their low esteem when it issues in a low act towards us. It's so natural to confirm to the other person that they are not worth our care if they behave in a way that we think is not worth us. However, neither we nor they have the right to overrule the abiding truth of God. Righteousness means respecting what is right and true. It's not a game of make-believe. It is a deep and committed engagement with the complex paradox that is our human experience. We are forever made in the image of God, no matter how well or how poorly we reflect that. God's salvation is the grace that releases us from every and anything that would hinder us from responding to that eternal truth, both in ourselves and in other people. And God does not waver in this commitment toward us. Though we may fail to respond to the repeated interventions designed to awaken us to this saving truth, God is by no means deterred from this intent. That saying of Jesus from Matthew 18, verse 21 and following, when Peter came and said to him, "Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? 7 times? That's a lot." Jesus said to him, "I do not say to you up to 7 times, but 70 times 7. This is an expression of the nature and character of God. And we more clearly reflect God's image the more we are like that. The more forgiving we are, the more like God we are. Because the point here is that God's interest in forgiving us is so far and away greater than any residual notion of judgment upon us. We often get that wrong. But in fact, the judgment that we're most familiar with in our life every day it no way resembles the judgment of God. We encounter the judgment of the world all the time. You don't have to turn on your social media or step out the door or whatever. And this judgment is based in a self-interest and a fear. Messages like, "You're not doing what I want you to do," or "You're different," or "You're not good enough," or "You don't fit in here." This is the judgment of the world. Divine judgment is not self-interested. God is not insecure. The judgment of God is always about ultimately unavoidable reality that will eventually overcome all our efforts to keep it at bay. And this is why Jesus told stories to illustrate the need to come to terms with that which we know to be true. You might remember in Luke 14, verse 31 and following, he talks about a king. What if a king, when he sets out to meet another king in battle, will not first sit down and consider whether he is strong enough with 10,000 men to encounter the one coming against him with 20,000 men? Or else, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. There's a big reality out there that's coming and you're going to have to deal with it. Come to terms. And the nature of our God is always gracious forgiveness. God never fails to hold out to us the opportunity to come to terms. If we persist with pretending to ourselves that we can keep reality at bay, then that's on us. Our judgment comes in the form of our chickens coming home to roost, and that will happen. For those of us who know the salvation of God, we are filled with gratitude for God's gracious kindness to us. I suspect perhaps the most penetrating diagnostic to discern the measure of grace a person has received would be the extent to which their life is marked by gratitude. You want to know how much someone knows about grace? See how glad they are, how much gratitude they offer in the world. Those who are forgiven much, love much. So many are so disgruntled all the time these days. Never have a people had so much and yet been so dissatisfied with it. It's as though we have, as a culture, lost our capacity for gratitude. We demand and we expect the best, but we have no idea on what basis or by what right, and we don't even really know what the best is anymore. We just demand it. This is a tragic symptom of a seemingly universal, extreme kind of hubris that marks the most recent popular models of human leadership. The new politics of manipulation. It requires the constant engendering of dissatisfaction and grievance. These so-called leaders curate outrage at just how bad things have become and then harness this blind anger to their own benefit. Whereas when we know the grace that has been extended to us and we are genuinely grateful, we need not pretend that everything's perfect. It never is. but we can still be filled with a profound sense of well-being. This in turn enables us to appreciate the many good things that are all around us all the time. And this gratitude has another benefit in that it grants us an increased sense of engagement. We're happier to be in the world, and that gives us agency to bring about change in our present world. It's just good upon good upon good. And like gratitude, although a little bit different, maybe even more profound, is the idea of joy. Those who know God's salvation experience a supernatural joy. It is often experienced as an uncommon sense of delight in everyday common things. So rather than needing external distractions to create the illusion of escape from the otherwise mundane existence of our world, God's salvation fills every situation with eternal meaning and purpose. Every relationship, every circumstance, every challenge becomes an opportunity for us to be a conduit of the blessing of God. There is literally nothing more uplifting or so full of meaning and purpose than discovering that you have effectively become the presence of God to someone else. When we respond to others from this place of joy, which is the fruit of God's salvation, our joy becomes contagious. And it also, by its contagious nature, multiplies. It spreads to others around us as they become open to God's salvation as well. And then it spreads deeper within us as we delight in seeing God at work in us and through us in more and more subtle and various ways. And this moves us to worship, to express our sense of how worthy is our God of all praise and honour and blessing and dominion forever and ever. The reality is, we're not actually able to worship God until we know the salvation of God. Before then, we're inevitably too full of ourselves, too caught up with ourselves. True worship is in spirit and in truth. It involves our becoming lost in wonder, love, and praise. And we simply can't generate that for ourselves. And there's little point faking it. God's not fooled. Yet when we know God's salvation, worship is the only sensible response. I mean, you could do a polite thank you, dear God, thank you for your saving me, yours sincerely, David. It doesn't quite have the adequate expression of what has transpired. We have become a transformed people. We have obtained our introduction by faith into this grace in which we stand, and we exult in the glory of God, says St. Paul in Romans 5. Worship of God is the only appropriate response to the grace in which we now stand. It is the only place, it is only from this place of saving grace that we can be free to make this response of true worship. And we may not have a ram's horn, a shofar as they call it in the Old Testament, but we have a flute, and we have a violin sometimes, and a recorder, harmonica and whistles. We have a piano and guitars. We lift our voices to our God. And importantly, we also express our worship of God at key moments in the life of our local community. We gather people both in here and out there, and Union Square, and walking around the streets where we do Stations of the Cross. And we remind each other and the community of the great things our God has done. And once we know this wonderfully other kind of salvation of our God that gives expression to God's righteousness and faithfulness and calls us into worship, and when we are filled with this gratitude and joy, and it just fills every part of our life, every relationship is transformed. We feel the impact of this change in every part of our life. It's not possible to merely continue as we were. As we live into and then from this generous saving grace of God, the way we live is imbued with the same grace that has met us. Not perfectly, of course, not fully or in every way, but in the direction that we are headed. We begin to move away from our self-serving critique of others, or our disdain of that which we secretly fear, or our aloofness from those things we find challenging to engage. And instead we choose to suspend our all too hasty judgment and seek to listen more carefully. We acknowledge our fears and we do what we can to not be blinded by them. And rather than the instinct to save ourselves by keeping perceived threats at a distance, we work out how to lean into that which challenges us and find creative ways forward. And this will disrupt the established ways of doing things, the systems of our culture, not with the purpose of creating chaos, but in the hope of a greater degree of soundness in all our relationships. The impact is not merely to relationships with people, it also, as we become transformed by this salvation of God, our eyes become open to our responsibilities as God's representatives on the earth. We have been entrusted with the honour and responsibility of being stewards of creation. The earth is not a resource to be exploited until fully plundered. It's a living organism. It's an ecosystem that we are to respect and cooperate with. We steward it for our benefit, but not simply for our own short-term gain. We are also to honour those who have gone before us and those who are yet to come after us. We do so by taking care not to damage and, whenever possible, to restore the complex systems that make human life possible on this planet we know as home. You don't need to be a tree-hugging greenie to see the goodness of a healthy flowing river over a stagnant and dead trickle where a river used to be. Rivers that metaphorically clap their hands with joy are much preferable to those which lie damaged, exhausted, or completely dead. That's just plain sense. And our response to God's salvation, our worship and our transformed relationships to everyone and to everything take place in real time, in real space, in this real world. Our responses affect the ways we are with our family, our colleagues in our workplace, our community. All these very temporal responses to God's salvation become imbued with eternal depth, which is to say, any response to another that is informed by humble integrity and is an expression of a heart intent on doing good toward the other is touched with eternity. Those things are eternal and they change people for eternity. The psalmist would have us sing a new song. This is a wholly new quality of song that can only be sung from a whole new heart or renewed heart, the heart that knows God's salvation. This renewed heart is full of gratitude, joy, and worship in spirit and truth, not in denial of the challenging realities of life, but in the midst of these things, there's a deep engagement in all of life. When we have a transformed heart, we cannot help but transform every relationship with every person and everything. We become agents for the contagion of God's kingdom, helping others to discover the freedom to enter fully into the eternal life that we also have discovered. Together with those who draw near to God with us, we sing a new song of worship, full of gratitude and joy.